Welcome to the Psychedelic Plate, a space where we explore the intersection of neuroscience, psychiatry, and psychedelic medicine, especially as it relates to one of the most challenging and misunderstood mental illnesses, anorexia nervosa. I'm your host, Fiona, a neuroscience major at Pomona College. Over the past several months, I've been diving deep into the emerging research around psychedelics and their potential role in eating disorder treatment. What began as an academic project quickly evolved into a deeply personal and passionate exploration, one that brought me into conversation with leading researchers, clinicians, and advocates who are all pushing the boundaries of what mental health treatment can look like. In this special episode, you'll hear from 3 incredible individuals, each offering a unique lens on this growing field. First, I interviewed Joy, a soon-to-be psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner who brings both clinical experience and lived experience to the table. Joy's story is both powerful and personal. After healing from PTSD through a psychedelic experience, she became a passionate advocate for alternative mental health treatments, especially following her daughter's life-threatening struggle with anorexia. Next, I sat down with Dr. Elizabeth Wassenaar, Regional Medical Director at the Eating Recovery Center and Pathlight Mood and Anxiety Center. With extensive training across pediatrics, psychiatry, and psychedelic-assisted therapy, Dr. Wassenaar offered a deeply thoughtful perspective on the neurobiology of anorexia, the gut-brain axis, and the importance of therapeutic relationships when considering psychedelic interventions. Finally, I spoke with Dr. Kate Godfrey, a research fellow at Imperial College London, whose work focuses on brain-based responses to psychedelics using EEG and other neuroimaging tools. More recently, Dr. Godfrey led one of the first ever feasibility trials of psilocybin for anorexia nervosa, and we discussed the cautious optimism and scientific responsibility required when researching this vulnerable and often overlooked population. These interviews took place over several weeks and reflect a timeline of growing insight, starting with foundational neuroscience, moving through cutting-edge clinical research, and arriving at a place of lived advocacy and hope. Throughout these conversations, one theme remained constant. Psychedelics are not a cure-all, but they may be a catalyst, a door opening into a new therapeutic landscape for those who have been left behind by traditional approaches. I hope you'll join me in listening with curiosity, compassion, and a willingness to rethink what healing can look like. Let's begin. Today's first guest brings a uniquely powerful perspective to this work. Joy is set to graduate this spring as psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner from Frontier Nursing University. She's currently involved in several groundbreaking FDA trials, exploring the use of psilocybin and LSD for conditions like treatment-resistant depression, PTSD, alcohol use disorder, and generalized anxiety disorder. But what makes Joy's story especially compelling is the way her professional path intersects with deeply personal experiences. After nearly 2 decades in emergency and critical care nursing, Joy found herself navigating her own battle with PTSD, a journey that led her to plant medicine in a single psychedelic experience that, in her words, flipped a switch. That healing moment became the catalyst for a new chapter, one that was further shaped by her daughter's life-threatening struggle with anorexia and the profound gaps in care they encountered. In this episode, Joy and I dive into the evolving world of psychedelic-assisted therapy for eating disorders. We talk about MDMA, ketamine, and psilocybin, and explore why Joy believes alternative treatments may offer hope where conventional approaches have failed. Her insights, rooted in both science and lived experience, help illuminate the urgency and promise of this work. So whether you're a researcher, a clinician, someone with lived experience, or just curious about the future of mental health treatment, this is a conversation you won't want to miss. Let's get started. Hear me?
Great. Yes, I can hear you fine.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with me for a few minutes. I really appreciate it.
Oh, sure. I'm happy to. This is one of my favorite subjects. So
I'm glad. I actually got interested in it sophomore year. They did a whole psychedelic conversation. It's kind of like 2 years later, I'm circling back to that conversation and making my whole thesis about it.
Oh, wow. That's really cool. Remind me which school you're at?
I'm at Pomona College.
Okay. And remind me, you're getting your psychology PhD?
No, so this is just every undergraduate student has to write a thesis at Pomona. So I'm majoring in neuroscience, and so my thesis has to do something in the realm of neuroscience, so I decided to focus on psychedelics and like neuropharmacology and the implications they may have.
Oh, I love that. I love that they are like introducing that to you just as part of the program. As like you were talking about a couple of years ago. That's really great.
Yeah, it's really cool. I mean, it's definitely been interesting, especially this year, going through research and just seeing massive gaps in the literature in terms of what's actually out there. So it's cool to kind of be at the beginning and like foundations of it, and then seeing where it goes in the next like 10 to 20 years and just seeing the evolution of it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was thinking about it as we were going to talk today, and I thought, wow, it's, I can say a lot of what I've seen personally, but it's like a lot of what's been published is very recent and very small studies, especially when you're looking at kind of the overlap of eating disorders specifically. Yeah, very much in its infancy, but this is a great time to be going through undergrad and have so many years ahead of you to get curious and explore all of this.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess, like, what brought you into studying, like, psychedelics and the implications? And do you focus specifically with eating disorders, or is it with mental disorders as a whole?
So that's a good question. So a lot of my curiosity and interest is in eating disorders. I can't say that I have a lot of formal practice with it yet, but basically my background is as an RN primarily. So I've been a nurse for about 20 years, since 2005, and I've worked in a whole variety of settings: emergency department, cardiac unit. I'm currently in the cardiac cath lab, and I have like I'm a certified emergency nurse, so a lot of my, background is kind of emergency medicine, a little bit of critical care. So I have been kind of, thinking for a long time about what I might want to do next. I thought many years ago about, maybe going back and getting my master's and my doctorate, but nothing really was quite sticking. When I was looking at various subspecialties, it just didn't feel like, something that would engage me long term. And so I just kind of kept going as a bedside nurse this entire time. And about, a number of years ago, or a handful of years ago, I actually went through sort of a series of very traumatic events. And I ended up having PTSD myself. And I had never experienced anything like that in the past. It was totally new to me. It was very bewildering and very debilitating. So I was really struggling just to function at work, at home, to, even just carry out kind of normal life stuff. And I ended up having the opportunity to, I had a very good doctor at the time who was kind of prescribing me every medication, that she could come up with that might help with my symptoms. And it would help a little bit, but nothing really kind of got to the root of what was going on. I also went through trauma therapies, multiple therapists who were really lovely and wonderful, but again, just my symptoms were really persistent. And so I ended up honestly being kind of dramatically healed with plant medicine from my PTSD. Actually, just even one session kind of broke me out of all of it, and I was able to actually have a full recovery. Got off my other medications that I'd been prescribed and kind of got, honestly, sort of a new lease on life. And then shortly after that, actually very shortly after that, my 10-year-old daughter at the time became very ill with anorexia. And so she, this was back in 2020, and she at the time I kind of thought, okay, I'm a nurse, 15 plus years experience. I've seen it all. I'll get the best doctors. We'll get the best treatment. She's going to be fine. And when, it's hard to kind of summarize that process with her and her anorexia, but it was acutely life-threatening. She got very, very, very sick. And I ultimately, even with all of my contacts and my training and my background, I was not able to successfully treat her at home. And I also wasn't successfully able to get a team here in our area of Seattle that would be honestly competent enough to treat her because of how sick she was. And so we ended up having to go out of state for treatment, and it was very challenging. And I kind of came away with this realization that we are really kind of decades behind even the research that we do have and how we treat eating disorders. And there are just very few approved treatments available for them. Well, really none. I mean, we don't have any FDA-approved medications for eating disorders. So obviously we have, some therapies that have some good evidence, like family-based treatment, but for the most part, families are kind of just left to figure it out on their own, and oftentimes receive very bad advice. So anyway, so we kind of went through that, and part of her recovery actually included ketamine. So I didn't really know a whole lot about ketamine at the time, but I knew sort of my own experience of healing from plant medicine, and I noticed that my daughter was also sort of failing to respond to a lot of the usual, medications that are typically at least trialed, for folks with anorexia, like SSRIs and second-generation antipsychotics and things like that. And so I ended up, thankfully, living in an area that's pretty progressive. I was able to find a doctor who would give her intravenous ketamine, and that was one of the many kind of big parts of her recovery and her ability to completely turn around. And she's actually in full remission now. So those two things in my personal life were kind of a big part of my decision to kind of go in this direction. So after my daughter kind of went through all that, I began just kind of informally coaching a lot of parents with eating disorders. I help run a very large support network for parents of kids with eating disorders, and particularly anorexia. And so I've learned kind of a lot about the illness, kind of just through my own daughter and kind of helping coach, probably at least dozens of families in the last couple of years. And then I, a few years ago, I started kind of thinking again about what my next steps would be professionally, and a lot of different things kind of came together for me to go back to school and become a psychiatric nurse practitioner. So I'm actually kind of right at the end of my program right now. I'm at Frontier Nursing University, and I have one credit left. So I'll be working in the field of psychiatry here pretty soon. And my hope is to work primarily with eating disorders, and also I'd like to work with folks who are interested in kind of combining psychedelic medicine with sort of allopathic medicine, and working more on the allopathic side of things primarily, that helping people who would like to kind of take advantage of the best of both worlds. And then I'm also involved in psychedelics research. Unfortunately, Seattle isn't really a hub for psychedelics research about anorexia or eating disorders, because we're not a hub at all for eating disorders treatment or research. But I am involved in some studies using psilocybin and MDMA to treat various conditions. And one is through a local university or a state university, and then the others are private. But that's been a very, very exciting thing to be a part of as well, to kind of be on the front lines of that research and be able to sit with patients as they're going through their medicine sessions and their preparatory sessions and integration, and kind of getting to be a part of the research that really is sort of seems to be kind of starting over again in a lot of ways, from where it left off, like in the, the mid 1900s, so, or mid to late 1900s. So that's kind of a little bit of my story. I've also had a chance to participate, I've sat with quite a number of people, on medicines, some who have suffered from eating disorders and some who have suffered from, other conditions like treatment-resistant depression. I can definitely say that I have a lot of hope for this field, for the future of being able to treat people who have eating disorders with various psychedelics. But I think we have a long way to go to figure out which populations are safe to give which medications to, and also, to know which, I think there's a lot that we don't know about essentially the risks and benefits for specific populations.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you for sharing your story. I am sorry for everything that you've gone through specifically, but I think, like, for me personally, why I'm interested in this topic is I struggled with anorexia throughout high school and into college. And it's really interesting to, first of all, understand eating disorders, because I think they are idealized and there's definitely a stereotype around what it means to have one. And I think it's really interesting hearing your personal perspective, because at least for me, it makes me appreciate it more and having that more intimate connection to the work you're doing. I don't know, it just makes it a more well-rounded experience. So that's, like, awesome to hear. I feel like I relate a lot to what you said. I mean, I personally, long-term, I'm still quite young, so I don't know what I'm going to do with my life, but ideally, like, I've always thought about, if I have the money and the funds and the people around me, like, opening my own practice centered around, like, an eating disorder center for the purpose of psychedelics. And just, like, hearing your personal experience is very exciting. And, like, I don't know, I'm just, like, filled with gratitude about this, because I think there is, like you said, so much more to be discovered and so many more trials in order to even actually start any treatment measures. But hearing, like, the personal insights and the personal stories adds to the potential of what psychedelics could do for individuals who are deeply, deeply suffering. So that's very exciting, and I'm very glad you shared that with me. Thank you.
No, well, thank you. Yeah, I'm so sorry that you went through that, but I think that's, I hope you're able to do that. I think, especially considering where you're at in your life with just kind of being an undergrad now and potentially having a long career in front of you, that could be within reach to even open a center that's focused on that. It's not uncommon at all to have people travel out of state. I don't know how familiar you are with kind of the eating disorder treatment landscape, but, there's people all over the world. I mean, I speak to people constantly in Western Europe, in Africa, in Australia, in Canada is a big one, who are, oftentimes willing to pack up and take their child or their young adult literally anywhere in the world, where they could, have a chance of saving their life. I mean, as you probably know, it's like anorexia has the second highest mortality rate of any psychiatric illness, and that's only secondary to addiction because of the rise in fentanyl, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So this is an incredibly deadly illness with no FDA-approved medications, and there's a lot of people out there who, like I said, would probably even travel, for the opportunity to go to a center that was focused on that.
Yeah, exactly. It is, like, mind-boggling to me when I first started doing research, and that exact, like, statistic, the only thing ahead of it is opioid addiction, is just mind-blowing, the lack of resources available for something that is so prominent and, like, prevalent across the world. It's really crazy.
Absolutely, and it's, for whatever reasons, it's not as sexy to study, eating disorders, right? There's not a lot of money in that research. There's not a lot of real interest, and I don't understand all the details of why that occurs. But you look at something like breast cancer. Localized breast cancer has a 99% survival rate at 5 years, and yet we pour immense amount of money into breast cancer, and it's plastered all over billboards, and yet, something as common and as deadly as eating disorders kind of doesn't get that same sort of attention in the research realms often. So.
Yeah, it's definitely, because I know you mentioned Dr. Sarah Pack, and that's essentially what my whole literature review revolved around, because that's the only study I could find out there that specifically had to do with psilocybin and its efficacy on anorexia specifically. And even with that study, I found it interesting how it was a phase 1 study, so it was really just looking at like the safety of the study, and like from that we now know that we can move forward with FDA trials and more clinical studies. But it is so interesting to see that paper came out like 2023, 2 years ago, and it's so interesting. Like, eating disorders have been around for so long, and especially as it relates to psychedelics, there's been such a lack of research, and it's so interesting to see, as you said, how, like, exactly why is that the case? What is lacking for individuals to not want to focus on something that is so impactful and has such a high prevalence around the world?
Absolutely. It's very understudied. It's, and I think all of psychedelics has been very understudied in the last, 50 years or so, with the legal obstacles.
Right.
And so, I think there could be a lot that happens in your lifetime. Have you had a chance to read I'm sure you're familiar with the MAP study on, let me open my computer here real quick. I'm sure you're familiar with the MAP study on MDMA for PTSD, but have you looked at the study where they kind of extracted the data on eating disorders and pneumology? Did you take a look at that?
I haven't seen that.
So that's a really good one to look at. Let me see if I can pull it up real quick and send it over to you. So it is called MDMA Assisted Therapy Significantly Reduces Eating Disorder Symptoms in a Randomized Placebo-Controlled Trial of Adults with Severe PTSD. So basically, here, I'll text you the name of the article, and if for some reason you can't find it, let me know, but I don't think you're going to have any trouble looking it up. And so basically what they did on this one is they looked at the data from the big MAPS, like phase 3 trial on MDMA, like the one that basically got presented to the FDA this past August in an attempt to, get FDA approval for MDMA. And what they did on this study was that they extracted the data from the PTSD study, looking specifically at eating disorder scores, because when they recruited for the PTSD study, they had everyone do like a number of different scales for different psychiatric conditions. And some genius out there said, hey, we should have these people with PTSD, we should have them also do like an eating disorder questionnaire to see whether they're having like eating disorder symptoms and whether those change over the course of the study. So even though the study wasn't like intended to assess eating disorders, it was sort of like a secondary, measure that they were looking at. And so this particular paper kind of looks at what happened to those the eating disorder questionnaire scores before and after their MDMA sessions, and they basically found a very significant reduction in the eating disorder symptoms of people who had received MDMA in that trial. And it was actually the thing that was even a little bit more fascinating about it was that the reduction in eating disorder symptoms didn't necessarily completely correlate with reduction in PTSD symptoms. So it wasn't just thought to be sort of like, okay, their PTSD is getting better, and so also their, eating disorder symptoms are getting better as a result. It was sort of like it was sort of independent of that. So I don't think there's like a really great understanding of why the data kind of looks the way it does, but it is very encouraging for the future of potentially using MDMA specifically to treat eating disorders.
Yeah, definitely. I'll definitely read that article. That's very interesting, because one thing I focused on, because there's such a lack of research for eating disorders specifically, obviously there's a high level of comorbidities between eating disorders and things like depression and OCD, and in this case PTSD, and even just understanding, like having a study that specifically exemplifies that individuals with PTSD that also scored high on eating disorder scales saw a reduction of that score is very interesting, and I think just goes to show that we can continue to promote the study of eating disorders specifically by extracting data from other studies that might be looking at other mental disorders. So I'll definitely read that article. Thank you for sending that to me.
Yeah, I think MDMA is very, very interesting, and I think in some ways, I'm very excited about psilocybin. Don't get me wrong, but I do think that psilocybin has some risks associated with it that that I think are going to be challenging for us to overcome in the next couple of decades. There's a huge component of, for instance, like patient selection for who's appropriate for what medication, and I think psilocybin has a lot of promise and carries a lot of potential for being very healing and in the long run, even being curative for a lot of people, but it does carry its own risks, especially psychological risks in the beginning. And so I think when you do your paper, you may want to kind of look into some of the compounds that I think are a little bit more gentle, include like MDMA and ketamine, including like low-dose ketamine. I don't know how much you've had a chance to kind of look into ketamine for eating disorders, but there's been some good work done there. Trying to think, there's this guy at Numinous, I can't think of his name right now, but he is Dr. Reed.
Oh, I think I actually reached out to him.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
He's great.
Yeah, I really wanted. He's like from Utah. Reed Robeson. Does that sound familiar?
That's him.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's lovely. And he, his background, he had run an eating disorder center somewhere. I don't remember where, but now he uses a lot of ketamine with his patients, and I believe he's even released like some data around ketamine being, using ketamine for eating disorders, but I don't really remember the details of it. But I've seen him talk a few times, kind of on Zoom and just listening to some of his some of the results that he's gotten with eating disorder patients has been really incredible, and that seems to kind of be part of his, part of his interest and his focus.
Yeah, definitely. I listen to some of his podcasts. Like I go on my walks and I'll put on his podcast, and he's very interesting to listen to. And like you said, the results of some of his data and just his research is really interesting. So hopefully I'll be able to talk to him. But, back to ketamine versus MDMA versus psilocybin. I am very interested to hear your perspectives on, or even just your opinions on which would be most beneficial. I focus on psilocybin specifically for how it targets serotonin receptors, which I thought was really interesting as it relates to anorexia. But like you said, there's so many different psychedelics out there that could be just as beneficial, if not more. So I'm kind of curious, like in your opinion, which one you think could be most of focus for the benefits of anorexia or eating disorders as a whole?
Yeah, so I think it's tricky, right? Because as you know, it's like if you've met one person with anorexia, you've met one person with anorexia, right? Everybody.
It's so different.
And like you said before, it's like there's a lot of kind of common comorbidities, including OCD, including PTSD, substance use disorder, major depression, generalized anxiety, social anxiety. There's a lot of different, even bipolar. There's a lot of different comorbidities, and some of those comorbidities would actually be dangerous to give somebody psilocybin with, right? If you've got somebody with bipolar, and you give them a macrodose of psilocybin, you could absolutely send them into a hypomanic or manic episode. And I have sat with people before, like in harm reduction settings, not, unrelated to any of my, study facilitator work, but I've sat with people who have had, hypomanic and manic episodes in a harm reduction setting, that were instigated by psilocybin and by LSD and by MDMA. So all of these serotonergic agents can induce bipolar symptoms that can be quite dangerous. So I think a lot of that comes down to patient selection and, kind of doing our best to give these medications to the right people. I think psilocybin has unique potential in some ways, like you said, with the serotonin component, especially like for folks with OCD, I think psilocybin can be kind of a game changer because you're flooding their brain with psilocybin. You're, temporarily kind of turning down that default mode network, and you're kind of allowing their brain to make brand new connections, to think in different ways, to kind of get out of those stuck patterns or ruts that we see so often, in people with OCD and eating disorders, and people who have, sort of a real, kind of the opposite of being creative, right? Like they're very
rigid.
Rigid mindset. That was the word I was looking for. So I think psilocybin can be really uniquely beneficial for mental rigidity and for some of the disorders that stem from that. For other folks, I've definitely seen MDMA be very helpful, especially when there's a trauma component. But I think even when there's not, there's a lot of potential there. One of the things that I notice a lot in folks with eating disorders is that their sense of self can be really fractured and can be very, very negative, and their self-referential sort of thoughts are very disproportionately negative and even can be kind of hopeless. And I think with MDMA, it does a lot of things in the brain. It does increase serotonin, temporarily. So there's some overlap even there with the classic psychedelics. But I think the way that it increases people's compassion and empathy, primarily toward themselves and also toward other people, can be really game-changing for for even how they see themselves, their bodies, their even just things like giving them permission to eat and to take up space in the world and to feel good. I think can be some of the levers that MDMA can pull, and also giving them sort of like a different perspective on their own trauma or on their own selves and bodies and personalities and relationships. It can kind of reframe a lot of things into a more positive light. I remember one person that I sat with a while back. This was a really kind of memorable moment for me, where I had been sitting with this person on MDMA who had a lifelong struggle with anorexia. And at one point, she needed to go to the bathroom, and so she went, and it took a little while, so I thought, oh, she's doing all right. But, she finally came back about 10 minutes later, and she comes up to me, and she goes, Joy, she goes, something happened. I said, what's going on? She goes, well, I was in the bathroom. She goes, I looked at myself in the mirror, and I liked it. I liked what I saw. And she just had this huge smile on her face. And she's like, never had that happen before. And this is a woman in her 40s.
Our next guest is Dr. Elizabeth Wassenaar. She is a regional medical director for the Mountain West regions at the Eating Recovery Center and Pathlight Mood and Anxiety Center. With a background that spans pharmacology, pediatrics, and both adult and child psychiatry, Dr. Wassenaar brings a uniquely integrative lens to the treatment of complex mental health conditions. She is trained extensively in psychodynamic psychotherapy and psychedelic-assisted therapy, making her a powerful advocate for holistic, evidence-informed approaches to healing. In our conversation, Dr. Wassenaar and I unpack some of the most compelling questions in the field. Can psychedelics disrupt the rigid neural pathways characteristic of anorexia nervosa? How might psilocybin and ketamine support new cognitive and emotional patterns? And what role does the gut-brain axis play in shaping our mental health? Dr. Wassenaar offered nuanced insights into the neurobiological underpinnings of anorexia and how psychedelics may create psychological flexibility, what she describes as the ability to reevaluate long-held beliefs and emotional narratives. We also explored the serotonin-rich pathways of the gut and how psychedelics might influence mood and behavior through this lesser-discussed channel. But perhaps the most powerful part of our conversation was a reminder that psychedelics aren't magic bullets. They're tools best used within the context of safe, relational, and well-integrated care. From discussing the unique vulnerabilities of those with eating disorders to highlighting the ethical complexities of clinical trials, Dr. Wassenaar brings both scientific depth and clinical compassion to the table. As she so eloquently put it, the process is so far more about the journey than the destination. So whether you're a researcher, clinician, or someone who cares deeply about the future of mental health treatment, this is a conversation that invites curiosity, compassion, and a broader vision for healing. Let's get into it.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, how exciting, this project you're working on.
I know, yeah. It's definitely been a long term in the making. I'm a neuro major at Pomona, and I attended a psychedelic kind of like lecture my sophomore year, and it was really cool. It was mainly talking about like PTSD, substance abuse, and how psychedelics could be used in that. And then I kind of wanted to elaborate on that 2 years later and talk about different disorders I think are really relevant. So yeah, it's really cool to see.
Excellent. Very cool, very cool.
Yeah. So I guess, well, thank you again for meeting with me, but I guess just to get started, I just want to hear a little bit about your background and how you ended up kind of entering this field.
Yeah, absolutely. So I, let's see, how far back should I go? So I trained in residency in psychiatry and pediatrics. Prior to that, I had done some graduate work in pharmacology, so I have sort of a history of being very interested in, like, I don't know, the way things work, and like what is the most basic way that we can help people get better, like what came before. In my psychiatry residency, I ended up doing quite a bit of extra training in psychotherapy. So I did training in family therapy and psychodynamic and psychoanalytic therapy, and that all really kind of evolved into being interested in initially the use of ketamine for the treatment of people with eating disorders. And very soon after I started prescribing ketamine, I became interested in the use of ketamine-assisted psychotherapy and how we could augment this psychopharmacologic intervention with a psychotherapeutic intervention that could make the whole thing work better and have longer, more lasting impact. And then from there, and I think partially because I live in Colorado, I've had an opportunity to be connected to people who are working in the psychedelic space. I was asked to be the medical monitor for a FDA a medical trial to test MDMA for the treatment of eating disorders through MAPS. They ended up not going forward with recruiting patients for that study because they put their effort into getting FDA approval for the use of MDMA for PTSD. But we did quite a bit of groundwork to sort of look at the use of MDMA and MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for the treatment of eating disorders. And then, so from there, I've just been very interested in what people are doing in the research space around using psilocybin and LSD and things like that for the treatment of both eating disorders, but also larger mental illness.
Yeah, definitely. Was the MDMA trial from 2022 with Brewerton?
Yeah, the Med 1 trial.
With Brewerton, because I wrote in my literature review about MDMA, and because I was talking about comorbidities between eating disorders and other mental health issues, and I brought up a trial where it was focused on PTSD, but they also did an eating attitude test as well.
Yeah, no, not that one. So, that was Tim Brewerton. So he's done quite a bit of good work in the psychedelic space as well. This was actually different. So we were never able to recruit patients for this. So if you look, it is actually still on the MAPS website. It's just called Med 1, all one word, MED, the number 1.
Oh, yeah, I see that.
Yep. So that was approved by the NIMH, and we were going forward, and then it was put on pause. I guess it's still technically paused.
Yeah. Oh, that's super cool, though.
Yeah. We were very, very excited about it. My name didn't even make it on the final list, whatever. So we were one of the things that was really exciting about that is we were going to look at the use of MDMA for the treatment of anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating disorder.
Oh,
so
wow.
we were going to look at it in the treatment of all 3 of those diagnoses of eating disorders, and people did not have to have a history of trauma in order to qualify. So anyway, it was going to be exciting.
Yeah, put on pause. Maybe it'll come back. Yeah.
Yep. But I think in Colorado right now, there's a lot of new and expanded access for the use of psychedelics. So, the groundwork is still being laid a little bit on getting the right licensure in place and the supply lines and all of that. But I think that there is a probable path forward to actually legally use psychedelics for the treatment of eating disorders in Colorado in the near future.
Yeah, well, that's awesome to hear. It is really interesting because when I started doing research, there's really nothing out there. Like, my major part of my literature review is just focused on Dr. Sarah Pack and her, open trial phase 1 with psilocybin. And that was really it. So it's been a lot of, trying to figure out potential mechanisms and, efficacy of how it could work. But
yeah, there should be literature both from UCSD and from Hopkins. They've both done work on psilocybin and eating disorders.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we had several patients go to the UCSD site. So you should be able to find that as well.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I've reached out to at least Johns Hopkins about it because I know they have a lot of ongoing trials right now. But yeah, it would be really cool to talk with people there as well. But I watched your YouTube video and you kind of just mentioned this as well. But what made you focus on ketamine, or I guess now you've broadened it a little bit, but ketamine specifically, because my literature specifically focused on psilocybin just because I was interested in the interaction with serotonin. But what made you kind of focus on ketamine and then broaden a little bit?
So, truly the reason is that ketamine is available. I could prescribe it today. So, so it was the most accessible option. in terms of using something novel to treat eating disorders. The reason I like ketamine a lot is, it's not a traditional psychedelic. It's a dissociative anesthetic. So it works very, very differently. People have described that it gives you the experience of more of like a bird's eye view of yourself and your relationship to the illness. Ketamine as a pharmacologic agent is very, very interesting because it works as a rapidly acting antidepressant. It helps us significantly with the suicidality that accompanies malnutrition and people with eating disorders. So we're able to use it to sort of stabilize people from a psychological safety perspective. Like patients in eating disorder treatment very often will have to actually leave treatment because they become too suicidal. It's a very, very common thing that disrupts their ability to stay in treatment. And part of that is because when you challenge someone's eating disorder, it is very, very distressing to them. And so they feel like they can't survive that challenge. But then there also is likely like an overlap of how malnutrition impacts the brain and the sort of preoccupation with dying. So we used ketamine to really specifically target some of the depression and suicidality that interrupts the ability to stay safely in treatment. And then ketamine, because of the way it works in the brain, it causes neurogenesis and allows you to form new habits. It resets your reward pathway. So these are all things that we think are probably disrupted in people who have eating disorders. We know that people who have long-term malnutrition have brain loss. So if we can support neurogenesis, it's tremendously impactful for them. So it has to do a lot with I think there is emerging literature that other psychedelics have similar impacts on the brain, especially psilocybin and LSD. Not so much with MDMA, but we have the majority of the literature on ketamine because it was legal when we started using it off-label 20 years ago. So maybe in 20 years we'll have a similar amount of data on psilocybin. Right now.
Hopefully, fingers crossed.
Right.
Because one of the things I focused on was like the homeostatic and hedonic pathways. So kind of going with the reward system. Is there like an understanding of the details of how ketamine like resets that reward system or helps to regulate or maintain it?
Yeah, there is. So it has to do, if I remember correctly, this time, I think it has to do with the glutamate pathway. So it rapidly resets how you experience things that are rewarding by the way that it interacts with the glutamate pathway.
Oh, interesting.
And then secondarily, ketamine does interact with the opioid pathway. So in terms of how the endo-opioid signaling reinforces pleasure and reward, ketamine, like its main action is through the NMDA and AMPA pathways. That's where it interacts with glutamate, but there is a secondary pathway through endo-opioids that has to do with pleasure, and it also has to do with like ketamine is actually very effective for pain relief. So it has to do with sort of those interactions.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
That's super cool. Yeah, I remember, I forgot what the article was, but when I was reading about the hedonic pathway and the reward system, they did it for, I believe it was anorexia, and what they found is that because anorexia, as much as it is about appearance, it's also a lot about control and that rigid mindset. And this article talked about how there's almost an artificial reward that goes towards not eating because you're almost like rewarding yourself for maintaining control, which I found so interesting because that in itself seems so hard to break that habit. Because then it's like if you are eating, then you should be getting a reward from that, but at the same time, because you're in this rigid mindset, it works the opposite. It's so interesting.
Yeah, it's true. So people with eating disorders experience eating as life-threatening versus the vice versa, which is starvation is life-threatening. So something in their limbic system has gotten crossed, and so they do not experience the eating as life-saving. They experience it as life-threatening, which is why treatment for eating disorders is so incredibly challenging. And I think that there is absolutely a body size and shape component that has a tremendous amount of delusional stuff in it. You know, people get really delusional about their size or shape or what food will do to their body, but they really do feel that eating is life-threatening. So being able to rapidly reset that is incredibly impactful on the work we do.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I was kind of just speaking more broadly. When I was watching your YouTube video, you guys touched on, or you specifically touched on, how there's only 2 FDA-approved drugs for binge eating and bulimia, which I didn't know, and I was very shocked by, especially because of the high prevalence of eating disorders being like second highest mortality for mental disorders. So I was kind of curious what, in your opinion, both the lack of research and lack of FDA attention towards something that is so prevalent and common across the world.
That is such a good question. So I think that, that's a
I know, it's a loaded question. I try and contemplate it myself, and I'm like, I just don't understand.
So I think, so historically, eating disorders were highly under-recognized in how many people they impacted, right? So I think, society has this sort of image that eating disorders affect a very specific kind of person, a thin, white, privileged girl gets an eating disorder, and then the idea is also that this is like a choice disorder, like you said, like it's about control and vanity, and so there's been a historical tremendous under-recognition of how widespread eating disorders actually are. So we are gaining knowledge now that it impacts a lot more people than we thought, but it's a difficult population to study. So eating disorders are what we call egosyntonic, which means that people who have eating disorders very often don't believe that there's something wrong with having the eating disorder. And they will go to their grave saying that this is the best thing for them. They don't have the same sort of, like, if somebody has OCD or anxiety, we hear that people say, like, I wish I didn't have this. I wish I could just get rid of it. People with eating disorders don't say that. And so they are hard to get into trials and in study. They also have a lot of medical fragility within the mental illness. So, there's been this sort of arbitrary division of mental illness and physical illness. And the reality is that patients who have severe eating disorders are very physically incapacitated by their eating disorder and then usually get ruled out of participating in mental illness research because they're medically fragile. So it's been a really tough thing. It is, it's been a very under-resourced disorder in terms of like money for research. So I hope that there's more attention to it going forward as we have better understanding of it. But also, I think, it makes it sort of a good thing that like maybe something like psilocybin, which is more broadly impacting, could be helpful for these people, that there might be options that just have never been available before.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'm very excited. I don't know, for me personally, I mean, obviously I've done a lot of research within this, but the massive gaps in literature are just, first of all, very surprising, but it is kind of a little bit exciting to see, like, over the next 20 years or so, how it increases. So yeah, definitely very excited for that. But I guess based on the research you have done, have you, like, what have you believed to be some of the risks as of now, either like specifically with ketamine, psilocybin, or just like broadly as a whole? And how do you think, like you said, individuals with an eating disorder tend to be very fragile? So how do you think that impacts continuing to research?
Absolutely, yeah. So, whenever we use a new or untested intervention, there's always risks that we need to be really well aware of. So within the space of using things like ketamine and other psychedelics, we don't yet know the long-term use, especially of like a continued use of ketamine on the brain. So we don't know if there could potentially be long-term harm. I'm also, as a child psychiatrist, I'm always very concerned about using these sort of agents on a developing brain. So on an adolescent brain, I think that we have to be really, really careful. We are seeing an increased amount of diversion of ketamine. It is a substance of misuse, and so I think that for patients who have risks for addiction, we want to be very, very careful as well. And then on the physical side of things, these substances are not without physical risk. So, they can cause everything from blood pressure changes, heart rate changes, nausea. When you use psychedelic substances that have like a longer period of activity, very often you're unable to eat during that period. And if you are underweight and at risk for hypoglycemia, it could actually cause a sudden death. So I think that it's something that I hope that people take the appropriate care to make sure they have good medical monitoring around. There's immediate risks of the actual use of the substance in real time, and then longer term risks of we don't know yet what happens in 20 years if people use something like psilocybin or ketamine really more regularly.
Right. That makes complete sense. I guess follow up to kind of switching a little bit, but towards adolescence. I watched this YouTube video with Dr. Amanda Downey, who's at UCSF.
Yeah, I love Amanda.
Really great video. And one thing she mentioned that I didn't know is she said that you need treatment within 3 years of onset, or else the outcome will remain essentially the same. Like, it's much harder to get better following those 3 years. So because of the increase in prevalence, especially at younger ages, and because, psychedelics on a brain that's continuously growing because you're so young, how do you, first of all, when do you find it appropriate to start giving ketamine out? Like, at what age? And then what alternatives do you see for younger individuals who are struggling?
It's a good question. So I think, the first part of that is that we need to do better as a medical field at recognizing disordered eating earlier and getting people into treatment. This is like a bigger question, but we live in this very, weight-centric diet culture world. And so very often when people lose weight in adolescence, it's congratulated rather than like, whoa, hey, how are you losing weight? What's happening? And, are you just getting engaged in a new sport, or is this unhealthy?
Right.
So there's a delay in diagnosis, which also puts us a little bit behind the 8 ball. So we need to do better at diagnosing earlier, having less intensive interventions sooner because people are less sick. If people do get really sick, then making sure we really hit it with all guns blazing. So the most evidence-based intervention for an adolescent eating disorder is family-based therapy. So really getting the family involved, making sure we have good support for that, having therapists that are trained in FBT. And then there's evidence to suggest that you can use ketamine in adolescents for treatment-resistant depression. We use ketamine down to the age of 14 for treatment-resistant depression, not just the primary eating disorder, but treatment-resistant depression in the context of an eating disorder. There is a psychiatrist at University of Michigan, who's doing research on the use of ketamine in adolescents. There have been some papers looking at the use of ketamine down to the age, I think, of 12. Again, for treatment-resistant depression. Diagnosing treatment-resistant depression in a 12-year-old is a pretty big undertaking also. Like, to say someone's had adequate drug trials and looking at sort of the social determinants of health that can impact a treatment-resistant mental illness. So all to say, I think that it's an area where we need to be very careful and thoughtful, but there could potentially be a role, especially for those middle or older adolescents who have already been sick for several years. Since we're seeing eating disorders also start younger and younger. Now 10 and 11-year-olds are presenting with true anorexia. And we take kids in our facility down to the age of 8.
Wow.
So we do see younger kids with eating disorders who, by the age of 14, may have like a 5-year history of an eating disorder that's untreated. And so for those kids, we want to try to be as aggressive as we can, as early as we can.
Yeah, definitely. I interviewed Dr. Joy Laramy, who's from Washington, and her daughter. She talked about her daughter who had an eating disorder at the age of 10, and they actually had to go out of state to receive ketamine treatment. And she's talking about like how that essentially was the genesis of her entering this field, was that experience. And it is absolutely mind-boggling to me how early on this is starting now, and still there's so much that needs to be done in order to continue to improve the success of recovery. It's really crazy, but yeah. I guess just to close out, I was curious, it's more of an intimate question and you can keep it as broad as you'd like, but if you could share like a personal story of your own or with a patient about the impact of psychedelics, even if it's just like broad, obviously don't want to get too specific, but whatever you feel comfortable sharing, I'd love to hear that.
Yeah. Gosh, I actually have so many stories. I would say there are more patients than I can even think of off the top of my head that I know are alive today because I was able to support them with ketamine. And I believe that there will be even more patients than I can conceive of who will fully recover once I'm able to prescribe other psychedelics. And I think that being able to use psychedelics in a really thoughtful, careful, compassionate way for people who have tried all the traditional stuff really offers the idea that nobody has to die from an eating disorder. Like, this is an illness that we have tools for. So I think, it is still one of our most fatal mental illnesses. And so many people feel like there's no hope. There's nothing more to do. And so, I would say I personally know patients, and they're out walking around in the world because I was able to treat with them with ketamine. So I'm really, really hopeful for the future.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you so much. Hearing stories like that, just like, I don't know, I have a long kind of goal in mind that if I have the money, when I'm older, I'd love to open my own center, and hopefully psychedelics are more accessible at that point and do exactly what you do. So hearing stuff like that just really makes me happy. So thank you for speaking with me and also for all the work you've done. It's honestly amazing to hear about.
What's after college for you?
So I kind of had an untraditional route. I'm a neuro-econ double major. So I was originally going down the pre-med path, and I still technically am, but my goal is kind of to get into biotech side of finance and then use that knowledge to kind of facilitate the ability to come back into the sciences and have like the network of investors and et cetera. Because I really do want to open my own center and kind of bring back everything I've learned now and having these conversations and do something more impactful. So hearing this is just honestly really amazing, and I really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, if you have the resources and time, you should check out Psychedelic Sciences. It's in Denver in June, and I think you would be very inspired to be there.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
If you have any follow-up questions, just feel free to email.
Okay, perfect. And I'll send you over, if you want to look at it once I'm done, I'll send you over my thesis and you can take a look.
Fantastic. I love that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for meeting with me again.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Our last guest is Dr. Kate Godfrey. She's a research fellow at Imperial College London and a key figure at the Center for Psychedelic Research, where she leads EEG integration across a wide range of studies. With a PhD in pharmacy from the University of Auckland and deep expertise in brain stimulation, neuroimaging, and electrophysiology, her work centers on uncovering how psychedelics interact with the brain to support therapeutic change, particularly through the lens of neuroplasticity. In our conversation, we focused on a pilot study she conducted at Imperial, which explored the safety and feasibility of psilocybin treatment in individuals with anorexia nervosa.
many of whom had extremely low BMIs. This study wasn't designed to prove efficacy, but it marked a significant step in asking whether psychedelics can be safely administered to a population often excluded from psychiatric research. The results, though early, revealed promising signals. Some participants experienced meaningful shifts in symptoms, while others did remain unchanged. But most importantly, psilocybin was well tolerated, offering a foundation for future work. Dr. Godfrey and I also talked about the very real challenges of conducting this kind of research. Everything from limited funding to the logistical decisions behind choosing psilocybin over long-acting psychedelics like LSD. She brought a grounded perspective to the field, emphasizing that psychedelics are not a miracle cure, but rather, as she put it, a catalyst, a possible beginning to what is often a long and complex recovery journey. Together, we explored the identity-bound nature of anorexia nervosa, its frequent overlap with disorders like OCD and depression, and why the condition is so often overlooked in clinical trials. As Dr. Godfrey shared, the tragedy is that people with anorexia are often left behind, not because we don't care, but because the system isn't built to support slow, complicated progress. This episode is a powerful reminder that science moves forward in small, careful steps, and that even in a field full of excitement and hype, maintaining empathy, rigor, and curiosity is what really drives meaningful change. So if you're interested in how neuroscience, psychedelics, and lived experience are converging to rethink treatment for eating disorders, this is an episode you won't want to miss. Let's dive in. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for talking with me for a little bit today.
No worries. No, it'll be fun. What is this for? I'm curious. Like more detail.
Yeah, so I'm a senior at Pomona College, a neuroscience major, and part of our senior year is we write a thesis on anything that we find interesting within our major. So 2 years ago, I attended a psychedelic talk with a professor from UCLA, which kind of like sparked my initial interest, just how psychedelics could be used in the treatment of a variety of disorders. And then I ended up taking neuropharmacology last year, where I started to understand a little bit more about psychedelics and their mechanisms. And then when I was I'm also an athlete, so health is really important to me. So when I was going through psychedelics and what disorder I wanted to focus on, I found it crazy how there's not that much on eating disorders, and kind of wanted to pursue that as my option for my thesis.
Cool. No,
Yeah.
that's super cool, super interesting.
Yeah.
Very cool project.
Yeah, it's been fun. It's definitely interesting the lack of research there is and like the massive gaps in literature, but it's kind of cool to be able to sit down and talk to people about their perspectives and what they're working on, so it's been fun.
Cool. Have you spoken to anybody else?
Yeah, I spoke to someone who works at Equip, a big eating disorder center who focuses mainly on ketamine, and then I spoke with another woman who also focuses on ketamine working at another eating disorder center. So even though my research is more centered on psilocybin, I kind of just want to hear any perspective because there's not really any defined correct treatment for eating disorders yet. So yeah, it's been really interesting.
Cool.
Yeah. So I guess just to start with you, could you just tell me a little about yourself and how you kind of got into this career?
Yeah, sure. So I have a neuroscience background. So I'm from New Zealand originally, and then I studied there. I did a bachelor's in neuroscience and a minor in pharmacology, and then I ended up doing my PhD at a different university within New Zealand, and that was actually it was like a psychopharmacology group, but I did brain stimulation within that group. But there were like ketamine trials ongoing, and then towards the end of my PhD, like I'm still really interested in brain stimulation as well. I think it's also like quite an interesting like novel therapeutic strategy for psychiatric conditions. But at the end of the PhD, I was sort of looking for like next step jobs, like postdoc jobs. And in the meantime, while I was kind of like doing my revisions, I worked within our group that was doing like a microdosing LSD study at that time. And that kind of sparked my interest a bit more into like the psychedelic research and exposed me to that a bit more. And then a job came up at the center here at Imperial around that time, and it was kind of, they were looking for somebody who did EEG, which is what I kind of did a lot of in my PhD. We were quite a strong EEG lab. So it kind of fit with my skills in that way, and I had less so experience with the psychedelic side of things, but it ended up working quite well. And then I moved over to the UK to work in the centre here. And then, like, pretty quickly, a lot of my focus was put onto this anorexia study that was ongoing. The previous sort of study lead kind of left around that time, so I kind of ended up filling in alongside the PhD student who kind of took on a lot of that role as well. And we kind of, it was from about participant 7 onwards, it was me working with the PhD student, sort of running and coordinating the trial, and then now we're kind of writing that up. So I'm not only focused on that trial, I work, like, my primary thing is kind of neuroimaging, I guess, but also clinical studies, and my research kind of is all with the intention of developing, like, novel therapeutics across psychiatry. My PhD was in depression. I've now done this anorexia trial. We also did a fibromyalgia trial, OCD trial. I've definitely spent the most on anorexia since my depression sort of PhD, and I think it's like a fascinating condition. It's really complex, really, really interesting, like, especially compared to depression, which is, like, obviously more prevalent, but also kind of, like, quite broad and more so, like, mood-centric, whereas anorexia is so, like, behavioral and, like, it has a really rich kind of, like, there's a lot of knowledge there of people that are really expert in this condition, like, both with lived experience and also, like, treatment, people who do, like, kind of talk therapy or sort of existing work in, like, inpatient units or whatever it is. So it's been really cool for the last, like, 3 years, like, learning from a bunch of people like that, becoming a bit more literate in, like, anorexia in general, and also psychedelics. And so now I'm, like, pretty comfortable with kind of, like, what we do with the psychedelic clinical trials, how we operate them, how we run them, and then now, like, sort of writing up the results and what they can kind of say in terms of next steps to get these treatments kind of kicking off. I'm definitely more neutral, kind of like, there's a bit of hype in psychedelics, definitely.
Yeah.
Some people can definitely be like, they are the cure for all. And even just from, like, I mean, I came into it semi-neutral and just was like, this is really interesting, but I didn't have, like, preconceived, like, this will cure the world. And then from interacting with the patients, like, there were some people who it was truly, like, a transformative experience, and then others who didn't really respond at all. And that's the case for a lot of interventions. It's not just this. Like, it's sort of unrealistic to think that I think any intervention in psychiatry is going to be effective for everybody. And it's more so, like, we know that's a problem. We know it's, like, these conditions are quite diverse. There's probably different subtypes, or, like, there's different, like, states that people are in terms of what treatments they want to engage with. And it's just about, like, increasing the number of tools we have available for those people, accepting the fact that, like, many will not respond to each, but hopefully if you kind of have enough options, eventually they'll respond to one. So yeah, I think it has potential. We had quite promising results. Like, we did see a shift in their eating disorder behaviors and symptoms, which is reassuring, but obviously, like, it was quite a small trial. It was a pilot feasibility trial. The first questions were even like, is this going to be safe in this population? They have a really low BMI. Like, typically drugs are dosed based on weight. Like, is that a concern? Like, psychedelics are kind of been shown to not be dictated by weight as much in terms of the effects, and some people do dose by weight, and some people don't. We tend to just give a flat dose to everybody, and yeah, it seems that it was very well tolerated. We had quite a strict inclusion criteria. Like, a lot of anorexia is associated with, like, cardiac risk being higher because of, like, malnutrition or just, like, the weakening of the heart. It's one of the things that makes it quite a lethal condition, and that was a concern because these drugs, they affect the brain, but they also the serotonin receptors in the heart. So that was a concern, and we definitely can't say whether or not it's safe in everybody with anorexia, because we did an ECG at screening, and we had to kind of get that signed off to make sure that there wasn't sort of an underlying cardiac abnormality that might, like, increase their risk. So, but with those kind of strict inclusion criteria, our BMI entry was quite low even. Like, they were between, like, I think they were about 14. which is quite low. Generally, I think like under 13 is when you're like probably definitely going to be admitted. And so it was people kind of sitting at that just healthy enough to not be admitted to hospital, but definitely not recovered, as a lot of people kind of sitting at that quite stably for a really long time. And that was kind of our target population. Yeah.
Very cool. What psychedelic did you use for the trial?
Psilocybin.
Oh, you did use psilocybin. Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, because when I was doing my research, the only like real study I could find was with Dr. Sarah Peck, who did like an open trial phase 1, and that's kind of what my whole literature review is on, because that's the only one that like actually has already been out and like you could read about it a little bit, and there's been like opinions on it, so it's cool to see another trial going on in the works and like kind of finishing up now.
There's our one, and then they were all kind of operating in parallel, because there's actually another one as well that's yet to be published from Johns Hopkins. So the PEC study came out first, well and truly, like there at one point it was like a race, and now it's like, well, you've got us for like 2 years, so like you got that. But the Johns Hopkins also hasn't published yet, but they kind of started and wrapped up around the same time as us. I think it's a slightly different design between all three of them, but all had like quite favorable, I mean, they're all kind of pilot studies, right? And I mean, the PEC study, and even in the main paper, they're not really even talking about efficacy, which is so fair, because it's not really like a demonstration of efficacy, and we definitely need to stress that. It's more so, yes, it's feasible, it didn't harm them, it didn't make them substantially worse, and then there is some signal for a reduction, and then that should be explored further with like larger trials. So the current status, as far as I know, so we have our study, which is currently, so the PhD student is Hannah Douglas, and she submitted her PhD, I think about 6 months ago now, and she took a bit of a break, and now she's like in the final stages of writing up that draft of the publication that will be submitted probably in the next few months. We need to get it back and forth with all the co-authors and stuff. It takes a really long time, even though the study finished a little while ago. Like, it takes a really long time to get these results out. Like, it's just so there's often like doing a literature review is really hard, because like so much of what's going on you don't actually know about from the published literature. It's a good thing to check something like clinicaltrials.gov, and then that will tell you like what trials are either recently completed, ongoing, and it can kind of, in terms of your lit review, give you a bit more context of like the current status that's like yet to be published. So there's our study, and then there's also the Johns Hopkins study, and then the pharmaceutical company Compass is now doing like a slightly larger trial. Theirs will be listed on clinicaltrial.gov, so you can always cite it there. And I think it's more of an RCT design with 30 people per group, and it will be like a placebo versus a high dose, rather than like a fixed order, which kind of has its limitations in terms of actually being able to compare, especially when they're sort of given in a fixed order sequence. But that's the kind of next trial. I know they were having some like recruitment was quite slow, but it seems that they were still progressing with it, and I'm not sure the status of that study at the moment. But that's kind of the natural next step now, is using these initial studies, because the San Diego study, the PEC study, they used Compass drug. We also use Compass drugs, so ours was like an investigator-led study. We paid for everything, but they just gave us the drug, and they got our safety data. And then I think the other one they might have been more directly involved with, but they were kind of like the preliminary investigations of seeing how is this tolerable, is this okay, before investing in a bigger trial. Now we have that data, it can start to be kind of handed over to those like larger studies that will likely be done by more so like pharmaceutical companies who have the money to run these studies, rather than smaller like university-based labs that are more so interested in like mechanistic things, or like sort of novel like first indication type trials. There is a chance that like a university group specific to anorexia could pick it up and like have like a larger anorexia, especially if they're like kind of embedded within like a hospital that has like a really strong anorexia like treatment program or something like that. But we're just not set up for that at Imperial. We don't have like anorexia specialty in-house necessarily. It's not like the primary focus of a lot of the people in the department. We're more so like addiction focused. I guess, or that's kind of where the psychedelic center is headed at the moment, is in addiction trials.
Oh, cool. Why did you guys, because I focus on psilocybin for my thesis just because of its interaction with serotonin I thought was really interesting. So why did you focus on that psychedelic specifically for your clinical trial? Or was there like any back and forth between which psychedelic to use?
Yeah. So the current options, I guess, so like psilocybin and LSD, right? If you want to do a classic psychedelic, those are the two options. Or DMT. I don't know if you know much about DMT, but it's like a shorter acting one. So it's more, it hasn't been researched as much. So I guess when this trial was being formulated, like LSD and psilocybin are the two main ones that have historically been studied in terms of like therapeutic application, especially back in the day, like back in the 60s. So the choice between the two of them, I mean, a lot of the work done back in the 60s and 70s was in LSD. Like psilocybin was synthesized a lot later. It wasn't really used as much. But the problem with LSD is that it has a longer duration of action, so people will be sort of under the effects of the drug, tripping, for up to like 12 hours. And that's really resource intensive, like to have people working, like ordinary work, that it's like, it's so expensive and you just don't really have the capability of that as much. When you compare it to psilocybin, which is only like maybe 6 hours, 4 to 6 hours, it depends on the dose and the person. Some people are a bit longer, some people are a bit shorter. But it's a more manageable time frame to fit into kind of like ordinary working hours. So it's these sorts of really pragmatic decisions that are not at all based on like the science necessarily. I mean, they're very similar drugs. I think they have like the same primary mechanism of action. There's like subtle differences in terms of like LSD being slightly more like dopaminergic, but it's more so a practical decision and also just about sourcing the drug, like who's providing these substances, who's synthesizing them, and who can we get them from. And psilocybin has more so of like a pharmaceutical backing at the moment of pharmaceutical companies like producing it and providing it for clinical trials. And so then it's actually accessible and it's actually more practical to do in terms of running a trial and like the funding needed to do that. DMT is an interesting one because it's a shorter acting psychedelic. So if you give it orally, it doesn't do anything, but you can give it intravenously, or like people will smoke it recreationally. We wouldn't really have a clinical trial of people smoking DMT, but we can give it intravenously in a kind of continuous infusion manner, and then you can kind of control how long it is. If you give it just as like a single like injection into the vein, it will last about 15 minutes, and then people will come back around, and then you can kind of extend it by just continually doing a continuous infusion. And that's kind of a new avenue being pursued, looking at if DMT can kind of produce the same kind of antidepressant effects, particularly as psilocybin, because obviously there's, again, like logistical benefit of that. If you can have it be a shorter experience, there's less resources involved, it's less expensive, because currently that's a really like prohibitive thing about psychedelic therapy, is that you need 2 very highly trained individuals in the room with the person, is the current model, for 8 hours. That's a whole work day that you're having to pay for 2 people, one of which is generally like a psychiatrist, and they're expensive per hour. So it doesn't make it the most affordable kind of intervention. People could access it privately, but it's generally quite expensive. And then in terms of like integrating it into like the NHS or a public health setting, it's likely to not really be invested in because of that high cost. So if it can be more so similar to like the ketamine model, kind of an integration of the two, like ketamine is a shorter experience, you can have people sort of come into the clinic. Maybe we'd need to give more support, obviously, and I think even with ketamine there should be more psychological support kind of provided, or therapy alongside it. But it allows more of a turnover and it to be a bit more economical for people to be like an accessibility thing. So it would be interesting to see like DMT and anorexia, but I think that's a very long way off at the moment. They're still working through like the depression trials with that, and that's generally how it seems to go, that these psychedelics are investigated first in depression, because it is like, it has the broadest sort of impact. Like there's a lot of people with depression. It's the most common psychiatric condition, and it's also quite a simple psychiatric condition. So it makes it kind of a good first line psychiatric indication, and then it's these other ones are kind of taken up a bit later as more sort of specific, more niche, but also equally worthy of novel treatment conditions.
Yeah, definitely. I guess that was one of my big things, is that when I was just going through statistics and found that like eating disorders and anorexia mostly is second highest in mortality rates of any mental disorders. That was crazy to me because, like you're saying, a lot of research does focus more on like depression or anxiety because they're more well known, but I was always curious, and it's kind of like more of an open-ended, opinionated answer, but why do you think there's been such a lack of research with something that is very prevalent and is honestly very serious?
It's probably a combination of things. So I'll start with a pragmatic reason, which is like funding. A lot of people, like the more people that are affected by a condition, the more funding that is going to get, both from like charity perspectives. At the end of the day, it's like taxpayer money usually, is like these grants, and then also like even philanthropic donations to charities or even directly to research is generally because somebody, like a really wealthy person, knows somebody who had, like, you know, their son maybe committed suicide and they want to bestow their money onto research to that condition. So the more people that are affected, the more people are willing to donate to that cause, or the more sort of public need there is to address that. Because then if you think about like taxpayer money, and like that generally is driven by like global like burden, how much burden does that disease give in terms of like hours of work, productivity lost or something like that, and depression will come out on top of all of those just because of how prevalent it is. So like if you like, there's just less funding to do this sort of research is one answer, and then the other is that it's just such a complex condition that like is really hard to treat, and a lot of time people might like try and develop interventions, but if they don't work, then it's like quite, it like hamstrings the research a little bit, and you're really having to kind of like deal with less money to try and find something that's like a better, like for a harder to treat condition. It sets it up for kind of like a slower progression in terms of the research of like progressing those interventions forward.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I always thought it was a little bit interesting because even like understanding anorexia and like the anorexic brain, it's very interesting because it seems like everything is working counterintuitively. So it's really like the big thing that I found in my research is with the dopamine reward system, and how individuals with anorexia tend to have reverse dopamine reward systems. They almost get pleasure out of not eating because it's like they're allowing their control to take over. So it's like, yes, I didn't eat, and then dopamine's released. So it's like fictitious dopamine, which is so interesting. And like you said, it makes it so much harder to treat or even understand because the brain is just completely warped.
Yeah, and the behaviors become so ingrained as well, and like it has a really long trajectory of like how long people are generally like living with this condition, and then it becomes like egosyntonic, where it's like actually a part of them and their personality is their eating disorder, which is then really hard to separate out, and oftentimes anorexia is actually masking the effects of a different psychiatric condition. So there's a lot of comorbidity, and people may have like comorbid severe depression that is alleviated by the behaviors of the anorexia. So if you take away those behaviors and you do treat the anorexia effectively, the depression is there to treat next, or the OCD, or whatever it is. So even it's just not as straightforward as like removing the anorexia even, and there's a lot of work around like self-compassion and also just like thanking the anorexia for what it has given. Like there's a gratitude there in a lot of people for it like protecting them and like helping them through their life, and it's so complex, like psychologically detangle those things, and even then deal with the emergence of like worsening of symptoms as those things like do get detangled. It's fascinating. It really, really is. And like I really feel for a lot of the people with like lived experience of it, and just how much of an impact it has on their life. And it's really, really quite heartbreaking, that stuff.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess as a final question, you could be like as personal or like as broad. It's a little bit more of an intimate question. But do you have a personal story of like yourself or like a patient, maybe from the trial, about the impact of psychedelics that you saw or like witnessed or spoke about with them?
Yeah, sure. I don't really have any like personal for myself stories. Like I said, I don't have any previous like myself experience with anorexia or like really meaningful psychedelic experiences that have changed my life. But like I can speak on the participants slightly. and just that it is very broad, and it's hard because you never want to say a really positive experience without qualifying that like others did not have transformative experiences. So we had some people that even had like really intense psychedelic experiences that were like crazy, and they were like, wow, that was like insane, like there was so much going on, and like, but then they're like, I don't know what to make of that. I don't know, that didn't really help me in my journey with anorexia, and like I don't see a link here, and I'm not really like connecting it, and I'm kind of just a bit lost, and eventually they're just like, I'm not really responding, I guess, to this treatment. But there are others that just like have some really, really cool, interesting stories of like during the experience of like the things that are revealed to them. That's another topic actually about like whether or not like the insights that you have during a psychedelic experience are like ground truth, and sometimes they feel a lot like ground truth, but actually it can just be kind of like there's a broader message there that shouldn't be as specifically interpreted. But like a lot of people being like playing out like family dynamics during the experience, or like even just being able to sort of remove themselves from their body and give themselves compassion, or feel like, oh, I do deserve love, I do deserve happiness, and like having not felt that for maybe 10 years prior, and that like being able to experience that for the first time in that time, or even just being able to experience joy or just depth of emotion, or even sort of some of the more negative emotions, but just the intensity of that when there has been a long period of kind of emotional blunting, or just not feeling any of those extremes for a really long time, and that giving people hope that they have the ability to feel that way as an individual, and that they can kind of work towards feeling better and go through the really, really challenging process that is recovering from an anorexia. Like it's definitely, and that's definitely something that we know in our study. Like we don't give the drug and then it's done, like recovery, perfect, they're all good. No, this is an intervention aiming to like be the catalyst to allow them to start a very lengthy process of their recovery, and having to like continue to work at it. And we followed them out to like 12 months, and even in 12 months some of our best responders, I got like to speak with them, and they were still like, you know, I can still remember my experiences, I have these like motifs that I continue to think about, I continue to journal about. I've come so far, but I'm still on this journey. I still struggle with like, I still, you know, my eating has gotten better, but my compulsive exercising is still there, and I don't really know how to get rid of that, but I'm trying. And like, it's definitely a very long process. I think in clinical practice it would look very different. It would be definitely integrated into like a longer period of talk therapy. We only gave sort of a limited amount. We're limited as a trial as to what we can actually give. But if it is sort of more so integrated into, okay, somebody has a therapist that they see regularly anyway, and that kind of like is going on for the entire year afterwards, or even, you know, they get 3 months out and they're starting to kind of dip back and like doubt things, maybe then they get another dose at that time when they feel they need it to kind of restart the process, and it being a bit more adaptive. And yeah, and definitely we didn't necessarily implement like the optimal procedure, but it's hard to do that in like the limits of a clinical trial. So, yeah.
I feel like it's hard to determine what's even optimal in a lot of these situations as well.
Exactly.
It's so subjective.
Figured out through just like doing it.
Yeah,
and
just
like
trial and error.
Setting and just sort of seeing what people respond to, and you can do that super systematically, to be fair.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much for speaking with me. I really appreciate it. My literature review is due in like 3 weeks, so I'll send over a copy if you want to read it over.
That'd be great.
But yeah, thank you again for meeting with me. I really appreciate it.
I hope this has given you some context or some things to kind of work on.
Definitely. Thank you so much. Have a nice rest of your day.
No worries, you too. Bye.
Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. Throughout today's episode, we've heard from 3 incredible voices: Joy Laramy, Dr. Elizabeth Wassenaar, and Dr. Kate Godfrey, each bringing a distinct perspective to the evolving conversation around psychedelics and eating disorder treatment. From clinical insights to neuroscience research to lived experiences, their stories underscore both the urgency and the complexity of reimagining how we approach healing for those affected by anorexia nervosa. If there's one takeaway from these conversations, It's that we are still very much in the early stages. Psychedelic therapy isn't a magic fix, but it might be a powerful beginning. A chance to open up new emotional and neurological space. A chance to see, feel, and process differently. And for those who spent years cycling through traditional treatments without relief, that possibility means everything. As research continues, we must approach this field with both excitement and caution, with scientific rigor and deep human compassion. And we must make sure that the people who need help the most are not left out of the conversation. To all the researchers, clinicians, advocates, and families working toward a future where more people can find healing, thank you. And to you, the listener, thank you for being curious, open, and willing to explore these important questions with me. If this episode resonated with you, please consider sharing it or leaving a review. It helps others find the show and keeps the conversation growing. Until next time, I'm Fiona, and this has been the Psychedelic Plate, where science meets story and healing finds new possibility. Take care and be well.